If modern-day WWE were a horror movie, it would be one of those hackneyed slasher films where every time you turn around, another one from the group is nowhere to be seen. That's because every time we refresh Twitter, we learn of yet another talent release, one more substantial than the last. Braun Strowman, Aleister Black, Rusev Lana, The Revival, Ruby Riott, Andrade, Zack Ryder, Bray Wyatt, you name them, WWE has endeavored them. And that's not even counting wrestlers that just simply walked away at the expiration of their deals. It almost feels unprecedented, but it's really not. In fact, 30 years ago, at a time when the then WWF boasted a staggering wealth of headline talent, the roster changes from the start of one year to its conclusion proved to also be wildly jarring. I'm Jack from Cultaholic, and this is the true story of WWE's first main event talent exodus. The state of the World Wrestling Federation at the dawn of 1992 was one of two moods. On one hand, the roster, as noted, had an embarrassment of riches to its credit. Of the 50 most prominent talents at hand, 26 of them at press time have gone on to join the WWF Hall of Fame, while there are others that can and will eventually join those already inducted. But on the other hand, there was a very real dourness in the air. Scandals crept up on the Federation, tearing through their kid-friendly veneer. One crisis was, of course, of the anabolic sort. The previous summer, Pennsylvania-based urologist Dr. George Zahorian was convicted on 12 counts of illegally distributing drugs, 8 counts for steroids and 4 for painkillers. Zahorian had served as a ringside physician for WWF events in his home state, where he also sold steroids to the talent. In Zahorian's testimony, he admitted to selling steroids to one Hulk Hogan. Not long after the trial, Hogan appeared on the late-night talk show of Arsenio Hall, where the reigning WWF champion was subjected to questions about his own alleged use because, you know, 24-inch pythons and all that. So it was kind of a PR disaster when Hogan downplayed the use of steroids in his career, saying he only took them 3 times solely for rehabilitative purposes. Again, 24-inch pythons, they kind of stick out like sore thumbs there, Hulk. Hogan's public image took a major hit, as did, by extension, the entire World Wrestling Federation, for which Hulk was the leading man. While not the sole reason for a decline in WWF business, Hogan's claims earned plenty of blame for the ensuing downturn. The 1991 SummerSlam buy rate fell 20% from the previous year, while Survivor Series dropped 25%. The 92 Royal Rumble, with the world title up for grabs in the 30-man gauntlet, was down a head-spinning 41% from the 1991 event. Image-wise, this was a company in a bit of trouble. The hits kept on coming. Wrestlers attending a February house show in St. Louis were searched for drugs by local police and DEA, although nothing was found because reportedly they were tipped off earlier in the day about a possible search. The following month, Vince McMahon himself took part in a surreal discussion on Donahue about the WWF's various scandals, attended by a handful of names with personal axes to grind with Vince. Not to mention Dave Meltzer in full mulleted glory. Look at him. Once the granite jaw of professional wrestling, the WWF now had 2 black eyes and some teeth busted off at the gum line. Business slumped, public interest waned, and a lot of guys on the roster boasted physiques that may set off alarms. Others were just past their prime, and this all meant that change was coming. In regards to the beginning of 1992, you could list off 50 wrestlers that were either full-time WWF talents or something close to that. It's a group with an impressive number of former and future world champions, colourful characters, and era-defining novelties. Many of these stars will be on display at the 92 Royal Rumble in Albany. 44 of them were originally scheduled to wrestle on that card, in fact. At the apex of these 50 names, you had Hogan, the somewhat disgraced 4-time world champion. Though his living legacy had taken a substantial hit, Hulk still remained a hero to millions of school-aged fans as a pro wrestling icon. Also in the main event mix was Ric Flair, the all-too-recently deposed WCW champion that jumped ship following a monumental PR disaster facilitated by WCW headman Jim Herd. Flair's ring generalship and particular star aura were a bit of an odd contrast to 1991 WWF, but to many, he was a more than welcome presence. There was also Randy Savage, freshly returned from an 8-month retirement. Though pushing 40 years old, Savage was still a walking personality cult with dynamic energy and real credibility with what was now a diminishing fan base. There was The Undertaker, the 26-year-old burgeoning phenom that captivated audiences with his angry cadaver routine. Months earlier, the WWF made him the first man since Bob Backlund in '78 to hold the WWF title in his 20s. There was Rowdy Roddy Piper, aging manic malcontent that remained a cult figure simply on the basis of nobody out there being a better Roddy Piper than Roddy Piper. And there was Sid Justice, the towering badass imported from WCW the previous year. One look at Sid was to see a future world champion entering his prime. On suspension, but still tethered to WWF, was the Ultimate Warrior. Invisible since falling out with McMahon at the 1991 SummerSlam, Warrior was at home riding out his contract following an ugly dispute the previous summer. As it turns out, he'd be back down the road. All in all, that is 7 men in 1992 that could have won the world title tomorrow without anybody really batting an eyelid. Just beneath that impressive hall of talents was the highly stacked upper mid-card. Leading the way was IC champion Bret Hart, the 34-year-old master technician whose handsome looks and earnest personality had cultivated a major international following. Then there was Jake the Snake Roberts, playing the best version of himself as he sadistically tortured Savage and wife Miss Elizabeth. World Tag Team Champions, the Legion of Doom, were over everywhere they went, oft imitated but never duplicated. Veteran stars populated this tier, including former world champion Sergeant Slaughter, disputed former world champion Ted DiBiase, and popular heavyweights Big Boss Man and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Hey-oh, it never gets old. Viable duos like the Natural Disasters and the Nasty Boys helped also populate a decent tag division. No longer a tag team star was Shawn Michaels, free from the Rockers and preparing for his own ascent. Another former tag wrestler in Davey Boy Smith remained popular, especially in his native England. The Mountie and IRS weren't terribly hampered by their quirky occupational gimmicks and in fact added quality wrestling to this upper mid-card. Though at the time sidelined with a back injury, Mr. Perfect was young enough to one day bring his athletic brilliance back to the squared circle, but for now he was serving as a manager and commentator. That's an impressive list of 24 wrestlers, is it not? Now let's speedrun through the remaining 26. Former IC champions Tito Santana, Greg Valentine, and Kerry Von Erich. Duos like the New Federation, the Beverly Brothers, the Orient Express, and the Bushwhackers. A former WWF champion in the Iron Sheik, now known as Colonel Mustafa. Brutes like the Warlord, the Barbarian, Hercules, Repo Man, and the Berserker. An aging Jimmy Snuka, a now solo Marty Jannetty. Former $1 Million champion Virgil. The ever-reliable Rick Martel. Beloved Birdman Coco Beware. Veteran Steve Kean as Mangy Hermit Skinner. And a new crop of unprovens including Conan Chris Walker, Papa Shango, and Tatanka. For any era, that's a pretty respectable class of stars. Many genuine Hall of Famers, many names that would continue to be valuable for years after this point in time. As far as a roster of 50 goes, you really couldn't do much better than what the WWF had in early '92. But imagine if, of those 50 wrestlers, nearly half of them would no longer be there at the end of the year. Well, we're asking you to imagine that because that's what happened. Some were a little bit too suspiciously muscled at a time when WWF really needed to be focusing on guys who didn't look like they ate stem cells for breakfast. Some of the following names had other issues that went beyond muscular cosmetics. Others were just long in the tooth, and that sometimes gets swept away in regular house cleanings, and would have been let go even if the WWF were enjoying banner, scandal-free, businesses booming times. Nonetheless, nearly half of the existing workforce leaving during the course of the year is an alarming change. It began simply enough with the exits of a few veterans. Greg Valentine ended his 8-year tenure after the Royal Rumble, while Snuka, Barbarian, Hercules, and Pat Tanaka of the Orient Express finished up in February, all innocuous enough incidents. Less innocuous was the firing of Jim Neidhart, who was let go for refusing to take a drugs test at a house show on Long Island. This left new Foundation partner Owen Hart as an unintended solo act for a while. Of that group, perhaps the only curious release was Barbarian, who at 33 years old still brought something to the table as a capable powerhouse with a good look. Nonetheless, after a 4-year run, Barbarian was out. Come March, Marty Jannetty was let go, one of many revolving door exits for the former Rocker, and in this case, Jannetty was released due to an altercation outside of an Orlando nightclub in January, in which he allegedly got physical with a police officer. 6 months of house arrest for Jannetty meant that his revenge against Shawn Michaels would have to wait. WrestleMania 8 in April was the last hurrah for Hulk Hogan, who was going away for a while to let the heat on his tarnished name die down. He'd still be under WWF contract, but would otherwise be persona non grata for a long time. Hogan, though, wasn't the only big name that left after Mania. Roddy Piper finished up after dropping the IC title to Hart in a classic battle, while Jake the Snake Roberts had given his notice, having fell out with the company after being passed over for a booking position. In fact, Jake actually threatened to no-show his WrestleMania match with Undertaker unless he was given a contractual release that day. He got it, jobbed as planned, and then he left. That is 3 vital WWF stars from the 80s that wrestled potentially their final bouts with the company on the very same afternoon. But don't worry, the future looks bright. Sid Justice is only 31 and is theoretically a future world champion. Oh no. Yes, Sid quit the company at the end of April, just weeks after headlining Mania against Hogan. Sid claims that his exit was for creative reasons, but other sources have it as Sid refusing to serve a suspension for failing a drug test. All that time spent investing in Sid as a top guy, and in less than a year, he was gone. The Warlord and Chris Walker, 2 very chiseled physiques, disappeared after April. With Colonel Mustafa finishing up in May, that's 14 of the 50 wrestlers gone in roughly a 3 or 4 month stretch. Of that 14, half of them are in the WWE Hall of Fame, and 6 of them had held some form of championship in the company. And this was, remember, at a time when belts were few and didn't really change hands often, so it's a pretty big deal. And beginning in the summer, 7 more wrestlers who had previously held a title in WWF would have left the company, all before Thanksgiving. Von Erich's 1992 was plagued by numerous issues, including an arrest for forging painkiller prescriptions and a divorce from his wife of nearly 9 years. Relegated to the lower card, Von Erich last wrestled for the WWF in July and was gone by early August. Once the planned SummerSlam opponent for Papa Shango, Von Erich was replaced by Tito Santana. Speaking of SummerSlam, Road Warrior Hawk worked that show in, shall we say, a bit of a sluggish state. With a few failed drugs tests to his name, a defiant Hawk quit the company after SummerSlam, dissolving the Legion of Doom / the Road Warriors for 3.5 years. Road Warrior Animal continued 4th for the time being, but was sidelined come September with a serious back injury, at which point he too left the company. Sergeant Slaughter didn't leave WWF entirely, but the 44-year-old former WWF champion took a backstage position that August after finishing a house show run with the Mountie. Speaking of the Mountie, he quit WWF at the end of October after losing to Bret Hart in a matter of seconds at a TV taping. The following month, 2 major stars were fired after they were alleged to have received shipments of growth hormone, the British Bulldog and the Ultimate Warrior, who had returned to WWF at WrestleMania, saving an outgoing Hulk Hogan. Both men were in the double main event of that year's SummerSlam, and each were let go less than 3 months later. If you count Hogan as being gone, that's 21 of the 50 wrestlers leaving in about a 10-month stretch. This included 4 former WWF champions, 6 former IC champions, and 7 former tag champions if you include Jannetty's Phantom Reign. And that's not even counting main event level guys like Sid and Jake the Snake Roberts. Not that the WWF didn't backfill. In addition to bringing Jannetty back that autumn, they acquired the following performers in 1992. Nails, Crush, Kamala, the Head Shrinkers, Razor Ramon, Bob Backlund, Yokozuna, Lance Cassidy, Doink the Clown, Terry Taylor, Damien Demento, Bam Bam Bigelow, the Steiner Brothers, and Jerry Lawler. There are definitely stars in that group, especially guys like Bam Bam, Razor, and Yokozuna, who would demonstrate uppercard value for 3 or 4 years afterwards. But that's still a lot of sizable voids to fill for a company in flux. Oh, and Nails got fired in December for strangling Vince McMahon. Bit of a wild story, that one. So yeah, 21 out of those 50 wrestlers were gone by the end of 1992. And if you can believe it, 93 was almost as wild. Of the remaining 29 wrestlers, 18 more of them would be gone before the 1993 Survivor Series. Shortly after the Royal Rumble, Earthquake left the company, and then the following month, Kato of the Orient Express, now wrestling as Intergalactic Sex Toy Max Moon, departed, as did the Berserker. After a 1.5-year run, Ric Flair also finished up with the WWF, having given his notice all the way back in October after dropping the world title to Bret Hart. It was more of the same in March, as 3 long-lasting veterans in Big Boss Man, Coco Beware, and Repo Man, the former Demolition Smash, all left as well. The following month, former tag title holders the Nasty Boys were suspended during the European tour and subsequently let go. Bo Beverly of the Beverly Brothers also parted ways with the WWF, leaving Blake to flounder amongst the enhancement crew. By early summer, Typhoon was gone, off to fulfill his destiny of being the driving force, literally, behind the most infamous WCW debut debut of all time that August. Skinner also finished up with the WWF, having extended his stay playing the Illusion version of Doink the Clown that backed up Matt Bourne. Come August, it felt like the end of an era. Hogan officially wrestled his last match for 8 years with the WWF on a European tour, and some of his long-term associates weren't long for the company either. Eternal mainstay Tito Santana left mid-month, as did Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Hey-oh, still doesn't get old. Ted DiBiase ended his 6-year run after SummerSlam, bolting for All Japan, while Blake Beverly and Papa Shango were both deep in the undercard at the time of their exits. Before the end of October, Mr. Perfect, who had returned to the ring a year earlier, briefly departed from the organization before temporarily resurfacing at WrestleMania 10 in 1994. Discounting Hogan, who we included in 92's exits, 93 saw the loss of 1 former WWF champion, 2 former IC champions, and 7 former tag team champions. Not to mention formerly well-pushed stars like Duggan and Big Boss Man. So of the 50 wrestlers that began 1992 in the WWF, 39 of them had their in-ring activity cease at some point before the end of 93. While Jannetty and the Mountie, as Quebecer Jacques, did come back before the end of 93, that's still a mere 11 wrestlers that were consistently employed and mostly actively wrestling during that 2-year stretch. Randy Savage, The Undertaker, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, IRS, Rick Martel, Virgil, The Bushwhackers, Tatanka, and Owen Hart. To binge watch the WWF in this not even 2-year time period is to see drastic wholesale changes for a promotion that went from the dying vestiges of a once booming Hulkamania era to a wrestling entity struggling to find a new identity amid legal troubles and an audience and a roster aging out. WWE in 2021 may shockingly let valuable wrestlers go seemingly at random, but the product still feels the same as it did 2 years ago, and it's up to you to decide if that's a good thing or not. The modern roster changes are nonetheless alarming, but 3 decades ago, a more severe bloodletting took place within McMahon's empire as many Hall of Fame bound stars left for one reason or another. And back then, with the metamorphosis of the top to bottom roster, the company greatly changed along with it.